The vibration of the F-35 Lightning II is something you feel in your teeth before you hear it in your ears. A constant, reassuring hum of 43,000 pounds of thrust pushing you through the stratosphere. I was cruising at 30,000 feet, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the clouds in bruised purples and bloody oranges. It was the kind of view that makes you forget, just for a second, that you are a weapon of war. I had no idea that while I was up there, suspended in the peaceful silence of the upper atmosphere, the world below was already dead. I was flying directly into the mouth of the zombie apocalypse, and I was making good time. My radio crackled. It shouldn't have crackled. The comms loop on a secure military frequency is supposed to be crystal clear, a digital silence broken only by the rhythmic breathing of your wingman. But this was static, thick and jagged, like tearing wet paper. Then came the screaming. It wasn't the panic of a mechanical failure or a fire in the mess hall. It was a primal, wet, gurgling sound that cut through the noise-canceling seal of my helmet. "Tower, this is Voodoo 1, approach vector 30. Say again, Tower?" I asked, my gloved hand tightening around the stick. The leather of my flight gloves creaked, the only sound in the cockpit besides the engine's whine. "Pull up, do not land, they're inside the wire. God, they're eating him, The transmission cut with a sound that I can only describe as a wet snap, like a melon being dropped on concrete. I banked the jet hard left, the G-forces pressing me into the ejection seat, squeezing the air out of my lungs as the bladder of my G-suit inflated against my legs. I looked down through the canopy glass, expecting to see a crash site or an explosion. Instead, I saw chaos rendered in high definition. The Nellis Air Force Base, usually a grid of perfect discipline and great concrete, looked like a survival horror map brought to life. Fires were burning uncontrolled near the hangars, sending plumes of thick, oily black smoke choking the twilight sky. The runway lights were flickering, casting long, erratic shadows across the tarmac. But it was the movement that made my stomach drop. Tiny, frantic dots were running across the apron, not running in formation, running for their lives. And behind them, a swarming mass, a tide of bodies moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. This was an unexplained outbreak unfolding in real time, and I was low on fuel. I had 1,200 pounds remaining, no tanker support, no alternate airfield within range that wasn't radio silent. I had to land. I lined up the approach, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I could see my vision pulsing with the beat.
The landing gear deployed with a mechanical thud that echoed through the airframe. As the ground rushed up to meet me, the details sharpened. I could see the heat haze shimmering off the burning fuel truck parked sideways on the taxiway. I could see the shattered glass of the control tower sparkling like diamonds on the asphalt. The wheels touched down, the rubber screeching as I slammed the air brakes. The jet shuddered, decelerating past the rows of parked F-16s. That's when I saw Patient Zero. Or at least, the first one I would never forget. He was a crew chief, wearing the reflective vest I'd seen 1,000 times. He was standing in the middle of the taxiway, bathed in the red strobe light of the wingtip. I braked hard, the jet nosediving slightly as I came to a halt 50 feet from him. He didn't move out of the way. He just stood there, swaying. I popped the oxygen mask off one side of my face, panting, sweat stinging my eyes, blurring the head-up display. "Get out of the way!" I yelled, knowing he couldn't hear me through the canopy and the turbine whine. Then, he turned. The lighting from my landing gear caught his face. His jaw was hanging loose, unhinged, dangling by a thread of wet red muscle. His uniform was soaked, not in sweat, but in a dark, viscous fluid that looked black in the dim light. It was blood. So much blood it was dripping off his fingertips, pooling on the tarmac around his boots. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the heat signature of the engine. Suddenly, a security force's Humvee smashed through the perimeter fence to my right, trailing sparks and debris. It swerved, tires screaming, and plowed into a group of airmen near the hangar. But the airmen didn't brake. They bounced off the hood with sickening thuds and immediately got back up. Bones snapped, limbs at impossible angles. They scrambled back onto their feet with the agility of insects. This was day one. This was the moment history ended. I killed the engine. The whine powered down. leaving me in a terrifying silence. I needed to get to the armory. I needed a weapon. My sidearm was a 9mm meant for signaling, not for holding back a legion of the undead. I reached for the canopy release lever. Click. Hiss. The canopy began to slide up. The smell hit me instantly. It wasn't just smoke. It was copper and excrement, the heavy, cloying scent of a slaughterhouse in a heat wave. "Hey, Chief!" I shouted, leaning over the side of the cockpit, my boots scrambling for purchase on the rudder pedals to stand up. The crew chief with the unhinged jaw looked up. His eyes were milky white cataracts, devoid of pupils, glowing faintly in the reflection of the cockpit displays. He let out a shriek, a sound like metal grinding on bone, and sprinted toward my jet.
He didn't run like a man. He ran on all fours, his fingers clawing at the asphalt, tearing his fingernails out by the roots to get traction. He leaped, slamming into the side of the fuselage. I felt the impact vibrate through the metal frame. He began to climb. He was clawing his way up the ladder, his face inches from my boots. I could see the texture of his skin, gray and papery, sloughing off his cheeks. I kicked out, my flight boot connecting with his shoulder, sending a spray of coagulated blood across the pristine glass of the canopy. He didn't even flinch. He just reached up, his hand grabbing the edge of the cockpit rail, his grip so tight the metal groaned. I fumbled for my sidearm, my gloved fingers slipping on the holster release. The adrenaline was making me clumsy. I looked past him, scanning the tarmac. They were all stopping, hundreds of them. The pilots, the mechanics, the security forces, all infected, all turning their heads in unison toward the sound of my shout. The crew chief pulled himself up, his head cresting the side of the cockpit. He lunged, snapping his teeth inches from my neck, a string of bloody saliva landing on my cheek. I jammed the barrel of the 9mm into his eye socket and pulled the trigger. Click. A misfire. He lunged again, grabbing my flight suit, dragging me halfway out of the cockpit, my legs flailing, dangling over the drop to the concrete below, where a dozen more were already gathering, their mouths open, waiting for me to fall. The Beretta was useless as a firearm, but it was still a 2-pound block of steel. I reversed my grip, screaming through clenched teeth as I hammered the butt of the gun into the crew chief's temple. I felt the sickening crunch of the orbital bone collapsing, a tactile vibration that shot at my arm like an electric shock. The chief's grip on my flight suit slackened, his fingernails tearing through the fire-retardant Nomex fabric before he slipped backward. He plummeted from the ladder, crashing into the waiting mob below with a wet thud that sounded like a melon being dropped on pavement. The horde didn't even hesitate. They descended on him, tearing into his flight line fatigues before he even stopped moving. I scrambled back into the cockpit, my boots sliding on the leather seat, breath hitching in my throat like jagged glass. This was day one. This was the exact moment the world tilted off its axis. From my vantage point 10 feet in the air, the sprawling airbase looked like a vision of hell rendered in high-definition horror. The tarmac, usually a pristine grid of gray concrete, was slick with oil and black pools of blood that reflected the orange strobe of the emergency sirens spinning silently in the distance. I couldn't stay in the jet. It was a metal coffin.
I needed to move. I vaulted over the side of the cockpit, bypassing the ladder, and landed hard on the swept-back wing of the fighter. The aluminum skin of the aircraft was cold under my gloves, a stark contrast to the humid, copper-scented air rising from the carnage below. I looked towards the flight line fence. Civilians were pressing against the chain link, hundreds of them, their faces masked in a rictus of terror. But the horror wasn't outside the fence. It was inside. The unexplained outbreak had bypassed our security protocols entirely. Rumors of a patient zero in the infirmary had circulated that morning, some airmen back from overseas leave with a fever. But looking at the sheer speed of the infection, this was biological warfare on a scale the human mind couldn't process. I slid down the leading edge of the wing, dropping the last 5 feet to the ground, my flight boots hitting the concrete with a heavy slap. The impact jarred my knees, but the adrenaline cocktail flooding my system masked the pain. I was heavy, weighed down by my G-suit, survival vest, and the crushing realization that my training for aerial dogfights meant absolutely nothing in a survival horror scenario on the ground. A shape lunged from the shadows of a fuel truck, a security forces officer, his blue beret missing, half his face chewed away to reveal the glistening white of his mandible. He moved with a twitchy, unnatural velocity. I didn't have time to think. I swung the empty pistol again, but he tackled me, driving me into the side of the external fuel tank. The smell hit me instantly, rotting meat and ammonia. His teeth snapped inches from my jugular, saliva spraying onto my visor. I drove my knee into his gut, but it was like kicking a bag of wet cement. He didn't feel pain.
He only felt hunger. I jammed my forearm under his chin, pushing his snapping jaws back, watching the capillaries in his remaining eye burst from the exertion. With my free hand, I frantically groped for the release on my survival vest, finding the handle of my survival knife. I ripped it free and drove the 4-inch blade upward, under his jaw, piercing the soft palate and entering the brainstem. He went limp instantly, dead weight pinning me against the cold metal of the fuel tank. I shoved the corpse aside, gasping for air that tasted like burning rubber. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I wiped the gore from my visor, smearing a translucent red film across my field of vision. I needed to get to the squadron operations building. It had reinforced blast doors, secure comms, and hopefully people who were still breathing. I started running, the heavy rubber bladders of my G-suit slapping against my legs, making every step a labor. The base was a chaotic tapestry of destruction.
An overturned Humvee spun its wheels lazily in the air, the gunner still hanging from the turret, his torso ripped open, ribs exposed like a gruesome cage. I rounded the corner of Hangar 3 and froze. The Grand Plaza in front of the operations building was a slaughterhouse. But amidst the chaos, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a squad of elite pararescue jumpers, PJs, forming a defensive perimeter near the entrance. They were firing suppressed carbines, efficient and rhythmic. Fret, thwip, thwip. Bodies were dropping. I waved my hand, sprinting toward them, relief flooding my chest. "Friendly! Friendly coming in!" I screamed, my voice cracking. The lead PJ turned toward me. He was decked out in full battle rattle, night vision goggles flipped up. He raised his rifle, aiming directly at my chest. I skidded to a halt, raising my hands, confusion evident on my face. "Don't shoot! I'm a pilot! 77 Fighter Squadron!" I yelled, pointing to the patch on my shoulder. The PJ didn't lower his weapon. He didn't even blink. Behind him, the heavy steel doors of the operations building were slowly grinding shut. He keyed his radio, his voice amplified by the external speaker, flat and devoid of emotion. "Containment protocol is active. No entry. I repeat, no entry." "What? I'm not infected," I screamed, taking a step forward. The PJ fired a warning shot that sparked off the concrete inches from my left boot. "Final warning, sir. Protocol 6. The infection is airborne within a 5-mile radius. We are sealing the vault." My heart hammered against my ribs. Airborne? If it was airborne, I was already dead. But then I saw it. Behind the PJ, through the narrowing gap of the blast doors, a woman in a lab coat was screaming, banging on the glass of the inner airlock, her eyes bleeding black tears. She wasn't trying to get out. She was pointing at something behind the soldiers. I looked at the PJ's neck. Just above the collar of his body armor, the veins were turning a deep, pulsating black. He wasn't keeping me out to save the people inside. He was keeping me out to keep the food source for himself. The blast door slammed shut with a final booming resonance that shook the ground. The PJ lowered his rifle, his head tilting to the side at an impossible broken angle. He let out a low, guttural growl that didn't sound human, and the rest of his squad turned in unison to face me. I was alone in the open, armed with a knife and an empty gun, facing 6 fully armored infected Special Forces operators. And then, the air raid sirens stopped, leaving only the sound of their heavy, wet breathing.
The silence that followed the siren's death wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum, sucking the air right out of my lungs and replacing it with the thick copper scent of a slaughterhouse. For a heartbeat, the only movement in the hangar was the slow, rhythmic dripping of something viscous falling from the broken PJ's chin onto his pristine tactical vest. The fluorescent overheads flickered, casting jittery, strobe-like shadows that made their movements look glitchy and unnatural. This was survival horror in its purest, most terrifying form, manifested in high-definition reality right in front of me. The pararescueman with the snapped neck twitched, his head lolling uselessly on his shoulder, but his eyes, God, those eyes, were locked onto me with a predatory focus that shouldn't have been possible. The capillaries had burst, flooding the whites with crimson, making them look like glowing embers in the dim light. He didn't shamble like something out of a movie. He coiled, his muscles, visible beneath the torn fabric of his uniform, bunched up with hydraulic tension. He launched himself at me. I dropped my empty pistol, the metal clattering loudly against the concrete, and threw myself to the right. The air displaced by his lunge felt like a shockwave. He crashed into the heavy steel toolbox behind where I had just been standing, denting the reinforced metal with a sickening crunch of bone and iron. He didn't even grunt in pain. He just turned, his movements jerky but horrifyingly fast, like a marionette with tangled strings. I scrambled back, my flight suit slick with cold sweat that made the fabric cling to my skin like wet cellophane.
My hand tightened around the grip of my survival knife, the serrated edge catching the glint of the emergency lights. This was day one of the end of the world, and I was fighting men trained to save lives who were now hell-bent on ending mine. "Stay back," I screamed, the command dying in my throat as the other 5 operators began to fan out. They were using squad tactics. That was the most terrifying part of this unexplained outbreak. The virus hadn't erased their training. It had weaponized it. They were flanking me, cutting off my exit routes, moving with a silent hive mind coordination. I bolted toward the maintenance catwalks, my boots slipping on a patch of oil and blood. I heard the heavy, wet slap of footsteps behind me. I didn't look back. I grabbed the cold steel of the ladder and hauled myself up, my breath coming in ragged, burning gasps. A hand, pale and mottled with black veins, shot out and clamped around my ankle. The grip was crushing, bruising the bone instantly. I kicked down, driving the heel of my boot into the face of the infected soldier.
I felt the nose cartilage collapse under the impact, a wet, snapping sensation that vibrated up my leg. He didn't let go. He snarled, a sound of wet gravel, and pulled, dragging me down a rung. I swung the knife blindly, the blade sinking deep into the gap between his helmet and his Kevlar collar. Dark arterial spray coated my visor, blinding me for a second. The pressure on my ankle vanished. I scrambled up the remaining rungs, vaulting over the railing onto the catwalk, just as 2 more of them slammed into the base of the ladder, their fingers clawing at the metal grate I was standing on. From this vantage point, the hangar looked like a circle of hell. The emergency strobe lights painted the scene in flashes of red and black. I could see the textures of the carnage below, the scattered shell casings glinting like gold dust, the dark expanding pools of fluid, the way the light caught the saliva dripping from their jaws. I sprinted along the catwalk, the metal grating clanging under my feet, echoing through the cavernous space. I needed to get to the Flight Operations Center. It was the only place with a hard line to the outside world, maybe even a link to whoever was tracking Patient Zero. If there was a cure or an airstrip that hadn't fallen, the intel would be there. I burst through the upper maintenance door, slamming the heavy deadbolt home just as a body slammed against the other side. The metal groaned, the hinges screaming under the assault. I backed away, chest heaving, listening to the scratching and snarling on the other side. It sounded like a pack of wolves trying to dig through a wall. I was in the upper administrative hallway. The carpet here was plush, sound dampening, a stark contrast to the industrial horror of the hangar. But the air was colder here, deadlier. The lights were out, leaving the corridor in a twilight gloom, illuminated only by the pale, sickly glow of the exit signs. I moved forward, keeping my back to the wall, the knife held ready in a reverse grip. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every flickering reflection in the glass trophy cases looked like movement. I reached the double doors of the op center and pushed them open. The room was bathed in the blue light of 100 monitors. It was silent, save for the low hum of the server banks. The chairs were empty. No blood, no bodies. Just abandoned coffee cups with mold growing on the surface and headsets dangling from the desks. I rushed to the main console, my fingers flying across the keyboard to bring up the base security feeds. Come on, I whispered, wiping the blood from my eyes. The screens flickered to life, showing a mosaic of the zombie apocalypse. The mess hall was a slaughterhouse. The main gate was a burning pile of wreckage.
But it was the feed from camera 4, the runway tarmac, that made my heart stop beating. On the screen, in stunning 4K resolution, I saw the tarmac. It was covered in a thick, low-hanging fog, illuminated by the burning wreckage of a C-130 transport plane. But through the smoke, I saw movement. It wasn't the infected. A black SUV with tinted windows was idling in the middle of the runway, untouched by the chaos. 4 men in hazmat suits, clean, white, stark against the gray smoke, were dragging a struggle-bagged body toward the vehicle. They weren't running. They were calm, methodical. And then the radio on the console next to me crackled to life, slicing through the silence. A voice, clear and devoid of fear, spoke through the static. "Pilot," the voice said, "we see you on the monitors in the op center. Do not attempt to leave the room. You have been exposed to the chaotic variable. Cleaning crews are on their way to your location now." The lock on the door I had just entered clicked, not from the inside, but from the outside, an electronic override. The handle began to turn slowly. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was a loose end. The brass knob groaned, the metal screeching against the internal tumblers like a dying animal. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frenetic rhythm that felt loud enough to give away my position. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling,
coated in a mixture of grease and the dark, drying blood of the thing I had killed in the hallway minutes ago. The texture was tacky, sticking my fingers together, a grim reminder that this wasn't a simulation. This was a true survival horror scenario unfolding in real time. I scanned the cramped storage room. The air smelled of stale ozone and floor wax, a sterile scent that clashed violently with the copper tang of death creeping under the doorframe. I grabbed a heavy industrial fire extinguisher from the wall bracket. The red paint was chipped, revealing the cold steel beneath, and the weight of it felt reassuringly lethal in my grip. The door handle stopped turning. The latch clicked. Slowly, the heavy steel door swung inward, revealing the silhouette of a man backlit by the flickering fluorescent buzzing in the corridor. He wasn't a zombie. He was wearing full tactical hazmat gear, the rubberized suit glistening under the harsh lights, a silenced submachine gun raised to chest height. This was the cleaning crew. They weren't here to sanitize the room. They were here to sanitize me. I didn't wait for him to clear the threshold. I lunged. I swung the extinguisher with every ounce of hysterical strength I possessed. The bottom of the tank connected with the side of his helmet with a sickening wet crunch that vibrated all the way up my forearms.
The visor shattered, shards of polycarbonate exploding outward like diamonds in slow motion. He crumpled without a sound, his finger twitching on the trigger, sending a spray of bullets into the linoleum floor, tearing up chunks of wax and concrete dust. I scrambled over his body, my flight boots slipping on the slick surface of his suit. I grabbed his radio and his sidearm, the cold polymer of the grip biting into my palm. The hallway was chaos. The pristine white walls of the base were now smeared with long arterial streaks of crimson, looking like an abstract painting from hell. The overhead lights had cut out, replaced by the rotating crimson glare of the emergency strobes. Every rotation of the light revealed a new horror, a severed hand gripping a clipboard, a trail of shell casings, and the erratic jerking movements of shadows further down the hall. "Target has breached containment," the voice on the stolen radio crackled, devoid of emotion. "Initiate Protocol 7. Burn it all down." I started running. My breath tore at my throat, hot and ragged. I checked my watch. It had only been 40 minutes since the first alarm. This was the reality of day one. The speed of the collapse was impossible to comprehend. I needed to get to the flight line. My F-22 was parked in Hangar 4, fully fueled for a training sortie that never happened. It was my only ticket out of this unexplained outbreak. I rounded the corner toward the op center, skidding to a halt. A glass partition separated the hallway from the main command floor. I pressed my face against the cold glass, and what I saw froze the blood in my veins. The massive digital map of the world, usually lit up with flight paths, was swarming with red warning indicators. But it was the live feed on the main screen that shattered my mind. It showed the medical bay, specifically the isolation unit. The timestamp was from 3 hours ago. A man, patient 0, was strapped to a gurney, convulsing violently. His skin wasn't gray. It was translucent, veins pulsating with a bioluminescent violet hue before he tore through the restraints like wet paper. This wasn't just a virus. It was something engineered. A guttural roar snapped my attention back to the corridor. At the far end, blocking the path to the hangar access doors, stood a cluster of them. These weren't the shambling corpses from the movies. They were the flight deck crew I had joked with this morning. Their coveralls were shredded, revealing muscle fibers that seemed to be knitting themselves back together in real time, glistening with that same violet slime I saw on the screen. Their eyes reflected the red emergency lights, glowing with a feral, predatory intelligence. They saw me.
I raised the stolen pistol, the sights shaking as I lined up a shot on the lead creature, my former crew chief. He didn't growl, he smiled, his jaw unhinging to reveal rows of jagged, broken teeth. Behind me, the heavy boots of the backup cleaning crew echoed on the tile, closing in fast. I was pinned between a squad of soldiers ordered to execute me and a pack of monsters that wanted to tear me apart. I looked at the heavy blast doors of the hangar, 50 yards past the infected horde. If I could just reach the cockpit, I could ignite the afterburners and incinerate everything in my wake. But there was no way through. Then the floor beneath me shook. A deep, resonant boom echoed through the facility, shaking dust from the ceiling tiles. The radio crackled again. Thermobear of charges primed. Detonation in T-minus 2 minutes. They weren't just killing the witnesses, they were vaporizing the entire base. I had 120 seconds to fight through a wall of the undead, start a jet engine, and launch before the air around me turned into fire. I took a breath, the smell of jet fuel and rod filling my lungs, and aimed not at the zombies, but at the fire suppression pipes running along the ceiling above them. I squeezed the trigger, the recoil vibrating through my forearms as the 9mm rounds punctured the high-pressure suppression line. A deafening hiss erupted above the horde, instantly followed by a torrential curtain of chemical foam and freezing white suppressant that blanketed the hangar floor. The infected recoiled, their guttural snarls drowned out by the mechanical shriek of the discharge, slipping and crashing over one another in a chaotic, writhing mound of gray flesh and torn fatigues. This was my only window. I holstered the weapon and sprinted, my flight boots slamming against the oil-slicked concrete, every breath burning my throat like swallowed glass. The distance to the F-35 Lightning II seemed to stretch into infinity, the fighter jet sitting like a dormant beast in the shadows, its sleek, radar-absorbent skin reflecting the erratic strobing of the emergency lights. I vaulted over the body of a crew chief, his face chewed down to the white of the skull, the textures of his exposed sinew glistening wetly under the red alarm glow. I could hear the wet slap of footsteps behind me. The runners were recovering. My G-suit felt like a lead weight, the survival horror of the situation pressing down on my chest heavier than any G-force I had ever pulled. I reached the boarding ladder, my gloved hands slipping on the cold aluminum rungs that were smeared with something dark and viscous. 90 seconds, the radio in my helmet chirped, a detached computerized voice counting down the end of my world.
I scrambled up, hauling my body weight into the cockpit just as a blood-caked hand snatched at the heel of my boot. I kicked down blindly, feeling the sickening crunch of cartilage through the sole of my foot, dislodging the creature just long enough to swing my leg inside. I slammed the canopy switch. The thick glass hummed as it began to descend, sealing me inside a bubble of silence, muffling the screams of the undead who were now swarming the landing gear like ants drowning a beetle. I didn't have time for a full checklist. I frantically flipped the battery switches, the cockpit screens flickering to life with a high-resolution glow that illuminated the sweat dripping from my nose. The integrated power package whined to life, a low moan building into a scream as the engine spooled. I looked to my left. Through the glass, I saw a face pressed against the Lexan, a young airman, eyes clouded with the milky cataracts of the infection, his mouth opening to reveal teeth stained black with gore. He hammered uselessly against the canopy, leaving greasy smears of saliva and blood on the pristine surface. Engine start. T-minus 60 seconds to impact. The warning system blared. I smashed the throttle forward before the avionics were even fully green. The jet lurched. The parking brake groaned and snapped as I forced the 30-ton machine over the chocks. The airman clinging to the ladder was torn away by the sheer thrust, his body tumbling into the intake of the adjacent jet, disappearing in a pink mist that sprayed across the hangar floor. I taxied aggressively, wingtips missing the hangar frame by inches, the afterburner igniting with a blue-orange fury that incinerated the wave of zombies chasing the exhaust. I hit the runway. It was a graveyard of burning vehicles and wandering bodies. I didn't pull back on the stick. I yanked it. The fighter screamed into the night sky, the G-forces crushing me into the seat, my vision tunneling as I ascended vertically away from the tarmac. And then, the sun rose at midnight. Below me, the base vanished. A sphere of pure, blinding white light expanded outward in silent majesty before the shockwave caught up. The thermobaric charges did their work, vaporizing the concrete, the hangars, the infected, and the secrets of this unexplained outbreak in a single, purifying breath of fire. The shockwave hit my aircraft a second later, a violent sledgehammer blow that triggered every master caution alarm in the cockpit. The stick shook violently in my hands, the HUD distorting with static as I fought to stabilize the bird, climbing through 20,000 feet, desperate to escape the turbulence of the destroyed facility. I leveled off at 30,000 feet, the air smooth and cold. I looked down at the sensor display, the high-definition thermal camera panning over the landscape below. The base was a smoking crater, a black scar on the earth. But as I adjusted the zoom, panning toward the nearby city lights, my blood ran cold. The fires weren't just at the base. The entire city grid was burning. I could see the distinct heat signatures of thousands of people flooding the interstates, a river of desperate warmth flowing away from the city centers, blocked by grid-light traffic. This wasn't just a containment breach. This was day one of the end of the world. I keyed the mic to broadcast on the emergency guard frequency, hoping for a command post, a tanker, anyone. Mayday, Mayday, this is Slayer 1-1. Base is destroyed. I am airborne with limited fuel, requesting vector to nearest safe zone. Static hissed in my ears, lonely and infinite. I was about to switch channels when a voice cut through the white noise, clear, calm, and terrifyingly familiar. Slayer 1-1, this is command.
We tracked your departure. Listen to me very carefully. You cannot land. Do not attempt to approach any populated airfield." "Why?" I screamed back, watching my fuel gauge tick lower. "I'm clean. I escaped." "You were exposed to the patient zero containment zone without respiratory filtration for 12 minutes, the voice replied, cold as the stratosphere outside. "The incubation period for the pathogen is 13 minutes. Check your eyes in the rearview mirror, pilot." My hand trembled as I reached up and tilted the cockpit mirror toward my face. The whites of my eyes were gone. Capillaries were bursting, turning my vision a hazy shade of red, and a single black vein was pulsing violently against my temple.